Hello and good day, everyone. This is Mabel Abanyawan. I'm your host for today in discussing the American Modernist period, presented by Group 1. So allow me to introduce myself again and of course my groupmates. Again, I am Mabel Abanyawan, your host, and along with Andrea May Dichosa, Ginil Marlanao, and Javeli Medallo, we will be discussing to you the American Modernist period. So for the introduction, America entered the 20th century optimistically as well. Strong world power. Although this time period started off with prosperity, it soon became one characterized by two world wars and a severe economic depression. These events ushered in a new age in America. American literature, modernism as a writer, began to attempt to express modern life with their writings. So before I proceed with this passage, allow me to say that I will be presenting 6 key points in the introduction of American Modernist period for us to really understand what happened in the modern period of America. So during the Modernist era, it was an era of boldness and fast-paced living. The culture saw the Harlem Renaissance and the Roaring Twenties, also known as the Jazz Age. This was a time of flourishing art and extravagant living that acted as a prequel to the Great Depression. In literature, the era was characterized by a break away from traditional styles of poetry and other types of writing. So, this era was like a facade for the um, prequel of the Great Depression. So after the Great Depression, 19th century. So during that time, there was this called the Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age, after the World War, they lavished themselves in a lot of jewelries, a lot of extravagant clothes to have this persona that can afford everything, even though their economic state, I'm so sorry, the economic state is failing. Okay, so allow me to present to you the notable points during the American Modernist period. So number one, optimistic start. The American Modernist period began in the early 20th century with a sense of optimism as the nation emerged as a powerful world force. So, um, see that the word here is optimistic start because just after the Cold War, the Great Depression, no, and the Gilded Era, where they make this facade uh, persona, no, they began to think, how do I say this? They began to think in a sense of disillusionment, where they think that maybe um, the future will be okay, but then it turns out that it became worse. Okay, so that's how it started. So next one is that the floral flourish. The era witnessed cultural movements like the Harlem Renaissance and the Roaring Twenties, characterized by extravagant living and artistic expression, setting the stage for significant societal changes. So after the Gilded Era, maybe they thought that, oh, this could work. So uh, they proceeded with this facade until the 20th century. So, if you are not familiar with facade, imagine your friend that is poor and being a social climber in social media. It's like that. So that's the modern version of Gilded Era, you know. So you're like very very poor, but then um, you still buy things that you really cannot afford, and begging your mother or your father to buy things like this. So just you can be um, above or at least in the level of your rich or not so rich friends. Next one.
Themes. The literature of the era was oftentimes fragmented to cause confusion and intentionally break the flow of words in literature. Two major themes of the era were confusion and disillusionment. The two major themes of modernist literature, confusion and disillusionment, were a reflection of the changing world during the time. The world was experiencing rapid industrialization, urbanization, and technological advancements, which led to social upheaval and the loss of traditional values. This resulted in a general feeling of disillusionment and a questioning of the meaning and purpose of life. Modernist writers sought to capture this sense of confusion and disillusionment through their work. They explored themes such as alienation, identity, and the search for meaning in a fragmented world. These themes and this literary movement as a whole reflected the new mindset of the American people after the turn of the century. It was because of his mindset and the loss of hope in the American dream that the major authors of the time period, such as Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner, Eliot, and Pound, became known as the Lost Generation. So, in the early 20th century, American society went through significant changes. The country was becoming more urbanized and industrialized, and this brought about new challenges and opportunities for the people. This shift in mindset was reflected in the literary movement of the time, which came to be known as Modernism. Modernist writers rejected traditional ways of writing and explored new forms of expression. They challenged the notion of a fixed reality and questioned the established norms of society. The themes explored in their work were often centered around disillusionment, alienation, and the loss of hope in the American dream. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner, Eliot, and Pound were among the most prominent writers of the time, and their works often featured characters who were struggling to find meaning and purpose in a rapidly changing world. They become known as the Lost Generation because they felt disconnected from the values and ideals of their parents' generation. Overall, the literary movement of modernism reflected the new mindset of the American people after the turn of the century, and the works produced by the major authors of the time period highlighted the challenges and struggles that people face during this time of transition.
Hello everyone, my name is Jovely Medalya. So for today, we're going to tackle about this famous poet no during this period no, the American Modernist period. So siya si Robert Frost. He was an American poet no na which was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. So he spent no the first 11 years there until his father died of tuberculosis. So Frost and his mother and sister moved in with his grandparents. So Frost attended Lawrence High School where he met his future wife and co-valedictorian Eleanor White. So after no his high school graduation in 1892, Frost attended again Dartmouth University for several months. Pero hindi niya nakumpleto yung college and instead, he returned home to work a few odd jobs. And noong 1894, he had his first poem, My Butterfly and Elegy. It was published in the Independent. After this success, no, Frost proposed to Eleanor. but she turned him down because she first wanted to finish college. And then Frost decided to leave on trip to Virginia, and when he returned, he proposed again. Eleanor had graduated from college at that time and she accepted. They married on December 19, 1895 and had their first child, Eliot, in 1896. So in 1897, Frost attended Harvard University. He soon had to drop out after 2 years due to health concerns. And he returned to Lawrence to join his wife, who was now pregnant with their second child, Leslie. In 1900, Frost and his family moved to a farm in New Hampshire and attempted to make a life on it for the next 12 years. Though it was a productive time for Frost writing, it was a difficult period in his personal life. Eleanor gave birth to four more children. Two of his children suffered from mental illness and two of them died. So despite these challenges, Frost became accustomed to rural life and began setting many poems in the countryside. So when Frost was 38, he found a publisher who would publish his first book of poems, A Boy's Wheel, followed by North at Boston a year later. So it was at this time that Frost met Ezra Pound and Edward Thomas. Pound and Thomas were the first to review his work in a favorable light, as well as provide Frost with encouragement and advice. Frost claimed that Thomas' long walks over the English landscape serves as inspiration for one of his most famous poems, so The Road Not Taken. The time Frost spent in England was one of the most significant periods in his life and in his work, but it was very short because World War I broke out in 1914, and as a result, Frost and Eleanor returned to America early in 1915. So when Frost arrived home, he was well received by the publishing world. Frost famously sent at the monthly the same poems that they had rejected before his stay in England. In 1916, Frost and Eleanor settled down once again on a farm near Hampshire. Frost then began his career as a teacher at several colleges. And then Frost received more than 40 honorary degrees during his lifetime. In 1924, he received his first of four Pulitzer Prizes. In 1961, at the age of 86, Frost was asked to write and recite a poem for President John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And then he decided to recite one of his poems, The Gift, outright from memory. On January 29, 1963, Frost died from complications related to surgery. So his ashes are interred in a family plot in Bennington, Vermont. So, Robert Frost was known for his writing his own kind of poetry, one that did not seem to fit into any particular movement or literary genre. Though his poetry does sometimes contain some of the elements of modernism. So, he was very popular in his time, mostly because his poetry is so easy to read, containing what seems at first to be simple subjects and relatively easy to understand language. If the reader were to look beyond the surface level of the poems, however, one could find a much deeper meaning in Frost's poetry by exploring the different themes and motifs found throughout the poem, along with a closer look at Frost's choice in words, language, and form. So sa mga poem ni Robert Frost, one common theme was typically see again and again in Frost poetry is the idea of barrier building or isolation. So his work was let us say initially published in England before it was published in the United States. So that's why he's famous during this period kasi he was known for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech. Frost frequently wrote about settings from rural life as I was saying earlier in New England in the early 20th century, using them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. So that's all for my report, and again thank you for listening.
So good day everyone. I'm here to discuss about the literary themes of the American Modernist period. So the major literary themes of the Modernist era are confusion, isolation, and delusionment. So these themes reflect the mindset of the American people and the feelings that plagued them throughout the early 19th. T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of A.J. Alfred Prufrock is a good representation of the theme of the confusion by not only being confusing to read because of its fragmentation, but also by showing a man, Prufrock, who is grappling with decision making and trying to figure out what class of society he belongs in, like many during this time period did. So the theme isolation shows not only in everyday relationships but as the American people's takes on world's affairs. The US desired to remain neutral through both world wars, but eventually were forced into participation in another country. By Ernest Hemingway portrays the isolation felt by soldiers and common Americans. The theme of delusionment is arguably the most common theme of the modernist era. There was delusionment in the American people that the First World War would be quick and painless. The Great Gatsby displays the theme of delusionment in that he truly believes that he can recreate his past with Daisy. Catherine Ann Porter's story, The Jitling of Granny Weatherhall, shows confusion and delusionment that accompanies growing old and dying. Overall, these widespread delusionment reflected the loss of values and faith that suddenly occurred in American people at the turn of the century. What is meant by modernism in literature? Modernism is a movement in literature that calls for rejection of past literary traditions in favor of bold experimentation in literary techniques and structure to reflect the delusionment of the American society after World War I. What are the elements of modernism in literature? Some of the elements or techniques used during the modernism era include fragmentation of subject matter, stream of consciousness writing, and free verse poetry. So now let's move on to what are the main themes of modernism. Some of the major themes of modernist literature include the following: brokenness of the American people after World War I and the advent of subjective truth, surrounding oneself in decadence to distract from a pervading spiritual emptiness, a feeling of disillusionment brought on the horrific atrocities of war and lack of faith in the American dream. So, the major literary themes did the modernist movement focus on: a sense of disillusionment and loss forbids much American modernist fiction. That sense may be centered on specific individuals, or it may be directed toward American society or toward civilization generally. It may generate a nihilistic, destructive impulse, or it may express hope at the prospect of change. So, what is an example of modernism? Some examples of literature from modernism would be F. Scott Fitzgerald novel The Great Gatsby, T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, and Ernest Hemingway's novel A Farewell to Arms. So, what are the themes of modernism and postmodernism? The key difference between the modernism and postmodernism in literature is that modernist authors deliberately broke away from traditional styles of writing and focused on inner self and consciousness in their writings, whereas postmodernist writers deliberately use a mixture of earlier styles in their writings. The main characteristic of modernist literature. Literature scholars differ over the years that encompass the modernist period. However, most generally agree that modernist authors published as early as the 1880s and into the mid 1940s. During this period, society at every level underwent profound changes. War and industrialization seemed to devalue the individual. Global communication made the world a smaller place. The pace of change was dizzying. Writers responded to this new world in a variety of ways. So that would be all for my part. It talks about the modernist or the theme in the modernism, American modernism period. So thank you for listening and God bless.